Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we are delighted to have with us two of the most astute political observers in the state of California. Lori Cox Han, who is professor of political science and endowed chair of an American presidential studies at Chapman University in Orange, and Dan Walters, political columnist with Cal Matters. And I don't think this is a stretch to say that Dan is probably the most senior journalist covering the state of California and its political environment. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much. And George Skelton might take umbrage at that kind of characterization.
All right, we'll make it a cage match.
All right. Well, Lori, since you studied the presidency, could you tell us what it would look like if Gavin Newsom became president? How would he fit into the pattern of presidents?
Sure. Well, I'll start with the saying, I'm going to tweak it a little bit, that, the saying about every U.S. senator looks in the mirror and sees a president. Well, I think the same is true for every governor of California. So just the fact that he is governor of the largest state, which brings with it the most electoral votes, I think a lot of people just assume he would be competitive as president. So assuming he could win the presidency, and if we're going to assume that it would be 2024 or 2028, because he is young enough to wait it out until 2028, I think that depending on the coalition he put together to get to the White House, he would probably be governing certainly to the left, maybe center left. I would assume that if he made it to that point, he would have had to be more pragmatic on the campaign trail, put together a coalition that would recognize that the issues in California aren't necessarily the same issues nationwide. I do think that, and I'm native Californian, so I'm a little biased here, but, our state does provide at that level, I think, pretty decent training, maybe as good as you can get in terms of going into the White House, being an executive and holding that position in a state that allows the governor to be quite powerful, and also dealing with such a variety of different kinds of policy issues. But if he were to be president, that is a significant shift for the Democratic Party, moving towards a younger generation of leaders, which is certainly something that a lot of people think that they need to do sooner rather than later.
Yeah, Dan, now that he's won, and we haven't heard any pronouncements of whether he's running for president or not, what would we expect to see over the next couple of years that he would do in order to be able to prep himself policy-wise in the state of California to make himself have broader appeal?
That's a good question, and because I don't know that he knows whether he will be seeking that broader appeal or in fact running again in California. Because remember, there's a U.S. Senate seat up in 2024 as well. And Dianne Feinstein is, I think, likely, more than likely, to not seek another term. So he has an option in that regard. If it doesn't look like the presidency is going to be available, and I don't think he would take on Biden in a primary battle. Then that's the other option he has to continue his political career, go to the Senate. And so really the question is, what would he be gearing himself up for in 2024? A presidential run or a U.S. Senate run? If it's a U.S. Senate run, then it's more of the same. He's got about 2/3 support of California's voters, roughly, and he could probably just waltz into that Senate seat for the asking. And maybe it's even possible Dianne Feinstein might resign before her term is up, and then give Gavin Newsom an opportunity just merely to step into that Senate seat. If I can't remember whether he can appoint himself or not, but he could certainly make a deal with the lieutenant governor to appoint him under those circumstances. So the big question is, what is he going to be running for? Now, if he's running for the Senate, he doesn't have to do anything particularly more than he's been doing already. Running for the presidency, that's another question. I think it's clear that up to this point, at least, he's been trying to appeal to the activist progressive wing of the Democratic Party. The real noisemakers in the Democratic Party, the same people who support Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and those sorts, seeing that as the pathway to winning the nomination, of being just as confrontational vis-a-vis Republicans and kind of waving the bloody shirt, if you will, about that. And I would consider him to be doing the same. I don't know that he would try to moderate himself necessarily in a presidential primary run later on if he wins the nomination. Yes, but I think he sees himself as the standard bearer of the Democratic left, up at least initially.
Now, I mean, one of the hypotheses that Joel and I have is that if he were to run for president, he would need to make himself look more pro-business because, arguably, California has been voted the least attractive business state in the country, and that would be something that obviously they'd run against him on. Do you think it's likely in the next couple of years that we'll see kind of a slight drift to the right in terms of his own policies?
Well, he's kind of been trying to do that in a way already. He was going to veto this high-profile farm labor bill, for example. He's bucked the environmentalists on trying to keep the nuclear power plant open, Diablo Canyon. But it's difficult to do. Eventually, he caved in on that farm labor bill. He was being pressured by everybody, including the president, including Nancy Pelosi. I think it's very difficult for him to do that. He can't change California's attitude towards business. There's nothing he can do. He couldn't do it even if he wanted to do it because he had to deal with the legislature. And so I don't think there's anything he can do in California to change that. That's it. Now he will argue, of course, I'm a businessman. I know all this stuff. You can trust me. I don't want to do anything to upset the apple cart of business and so forth. And yet the policies that he and the legislature have adopted have added expense and burden and regulation to the business community to no end, including this fast food council that's going to basically, that fast food legislation that he signed that puts the working conditions and wages of fast food workers in the hands of a new state commission. It'll certainly be tilted towards union membership. Not only attacks the fast food industry's autonomy, but really undermines the whole idea of franchise business because it assumes that these locally owned fast food franchises are merely subsidiaries of the larger corporation, and that the franchisees are not independent business persons at all. That's a very substantial piece of the nose under the tent, so to speak, about attacking a fundamental tenet of American business these days, which is the franchise model that extends to automobile dealers and countless other industries as well.
So this is a question for Lori. Here we are, coming into the winter. I wonder if we see an escalation in this Ukraine-Russia problem, what kind of candidates typically come out of that crisis environment? Do you think that Newsom has the kind of makeup that Americans would look for if it were to escalate further and draw us in a deeper way?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about what does the political environment look like a few months from now, and if we're focused on foreign policy issues like that, I think that's a big disadvantage for Newsom if he's thinking about running. Looking at the timing here, though, it is pretty interesting. I think if he is seriously considering this, whether it's to challenge Biden in case the need comes that a Democrat needs to step in, or looking further down the line, as Dan said, it's going to depend on a lot of, Well, we'll know a lot more by what he's focusing on, his messaging. Where is he going in terms of policy? Is he kind of trying to get back slightly to the center, which would make sense on a national run? Or is he going to, continue to appeal to that progressive base? And we know he has that support, particularly in California. I think also thinking about whether or not he would end up in the U.S. Senate is really interesting too. I'm thinking back to, Pete Wilson left the Senate to be California governor. It would Newsom, be done being governor and move on to the Senate. I think if he's thinking 2028, he does have a strategic advantage in that he could stay governor. He would be out of office January 1st, 2027, not have a job for that next presumably 22 months to run for president. And you've got so many people that are holding office that it makes it difficult to do that. That would be a huge advantage for him. And to be able to say, hey, here's my track record. I've been governor of California, 2 terms, got elected easily both times. And, he could just focus on that, because after being California governor, if it doesn't work out in terms of the timing to be U.S. Senator, the next question is, what does he do? Maybe end up in a Democrat's cabinet at that point, and that would seem like it would kind of be the end of his political trajectory. So,
well, let me ask you a inconvenient question for both of you. We do have a former senator from California who is got, certainly does better on the diversity scale than Newsom does. Is Kamala Harris just out of the question? Is she just not, or is that going to be difficult? What happens if she wants to run? Biden, blesses her running. He's a white Californian running against a Asian, African American Californian who's already been vice president. Now, no one thinks, well, maybe somebody thinks she's doing a great job, but she hasn't been that important. Does Harris's presence lead to a problem for Newsom if he wants to go up to the White House?
I think so. That's really a tricky question when you look at it from the Democratic Party standpoint, because normally if the sitting vice president has presidential aspirations, they're normally considered a front runner.
Right.
And so if Newsom kind of elbowed her out of the way, that would be a difficult message for his campaign, I think, within progressive circles for the Democratic Party. On the other hand, she did run for president in 2020. Her campaign faltered badly. She had to end her campaign before any votes were cast. So you could say, well, she has some experience on the national level, but not great experience. And I don't think there's a lot of clamoring for her to be the nominee unless she were to become president before 2024 because of some unforeseen circumstance. And, there are so many variations here of what could happen in the next 2 years for the Democratic primary in 2024. It's fascinating. I think causing a lot of stress and anxiety for those within the Democratic Party, but for someone like me who studies the presidency, and I've studied a lot about women in politics and electing a woman president, I find it all fascinating.
Dan, what's your sense of having observed and known Kamala for all these years? Do you have a sense of where her head is at, or what she's likely to do, or is this not?
And also, what's the personal dynamic between those two? Because in these days, with the exception of people like Dan, we have no idea. I have a better idea what's going on the dark side of the moon than what's going on.
Let me throw my 2 cents worth in there. I think if push comes to shove, he would shove. And if Kamala Harris continues on her same trajectory, it probably won't even be an issue, because she has not set the world on fire as vice president of the United States. She's basically ignored by the White House, given superficial jobs to do, like take care of the border, Kamala. Yeah, how's that worked out for you? And this most recent gaffe of hers, where she said the U.S. has a wonderful alliance with North Korea, kind of solidifies the sense that a lot of people have had in California about her for a long time, that there's not a lot of there, that she is a mediagenic in a way, but cannot think on her feet, cannot really respond without great preparation, and script writing and staging and all this sort of thing. And if she continues on this, I mean, I saw a recent poll recently where a pretty small number of Democrats wanted her to be president of the United States if Biden doesn't run. I think that she would not be an impediment for Gavin Newsom if he in fact decided to run for president. I think he would just run and push her aside as best he can. And that I don't think she has the wherewithal to withstand that kind of a push. I think she would just fold up, as she did in her first presidential campaign. She couldn't sustain it. She was not enough there. And I don't think there's still enough there to mount a successful presidential campaign, and particularly if you're facing with a really ruthless opponent like Gavin Newsom would be.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, and Dan, maybe you know a little bit more about this than I do, but if I'm remembering correctly, and I hear a lot of people refer to them as frenemies. I mean, they can't openly attack each other, but it seems like there's a lot of animosity because when the decision was being made of who was going to run for governor in 2016 versus who was going to run for Barbara Boxer's Senate seat, if I'm remembering this correctly, Gavin Newsom stated, "Oh, I'm not running for the Senate seat," which kind of then left Kamala that as her only option, because the assumption was he was going to run for governor. And so just from what little I have picked up on, there is still animosity between the two. But I agree. I think that if Newsom makes a decision that this is his trajectory, then I don't think it will matter. He's going to have to be very delicate on that issue with some in the Democratic Party. But if that's what, like I said, if he looks in the mirror and sees an eventual president, I think that's going to dictate how that plays out.
Well, if you look through history, by the way, just the implication here is that she's been a disappointment and a failure as vice president. If you look through history, she's fulfilling the destiny of every vice president except for Biden for Obama, right? It's the only person I know who actually gave him a job. But most of the time, the vice president's job is to kiss babies and open supermarkets.
Yeah. Oh, as they used to say about a lieutenant governor, to pick up the newspaper, make sure the boss is still alive, and find a service club to give you lunch that day. It's. I think, given all it is, look at the national attention that Gavin Newsom's getting now for his. Damn the Republicans, full speed ahead, torpedoes. She's not doing that. I mean, Biden's doing more of that than she is. You haven't seen her out there on the hustings being the spear point of the Democratic Party vis-a-vis Republicans. I don't think she's got what it takes to mount a real presidential campaign. I think she folded up last time around, and she would fold up again. It's just not there.
Yeah, but I agree.
I'd like, Lori, if you have something to add, because I have another question. But
go ahead.
Well, here's something, and I know Dan's written about this, and Marshall and I have looked at it. We're assuming that he's running California the way it was 2 years ago. In other words, huge IPOs, rapidly, rapidly increasing property prices. The money's coming in, of course, the COVID money. What does Newsom do, and what does it do to his presidential aspirations if California starts running a deficit and he has to start making choices, particularly with the higher interest rates? It's harder to borrow. So, do you think that Newsom may face some new challenges given what's happening in the economy? I
think he will definitely face some challenges. We may not be in recession yet, but all the signs are there that it's coming. And that if the Federal Reserve System continues to crank up the interest rates, it's almost dead certain to occur. California, I've written this many times, probably too many times. I've said, if the national economy catches a cold, California catches pneumonia. Because of its nature of its economy, number one, it's very, very sensitive to global financial trends. And we've seen this in the past. We saw it most recently in the COVID recession. The rest of the country had an effect. California had an effect. California's unemployment rate soared up to more than 16% virtually overnight, highest in the country. So we see we've seen this pattern before. And if the U.S. falls into a recession, California is going to probably have a deeper recession, and that's particularly difficult for the governor because the state budget is inordinately dependent, as we all know, on a very, very few taxpayers. Personal income taxes account for 3/4 of the state's general fund revenue. And 1% of taxpayers, about 150,000 taxpayers in a state of 40 million, 1% of taxpayers supply half of those income taxes, half of them. And that their incomes are basically rooted in returns on investments, particularly in the stock market and other capital markets. And they take a beating in a recession. Those earnings take a beating in recession very quickly. The stock market's been really hit hard by this rise in interest rates and probably will continue to get hit hard. California's revenues through the first couple of months of the fiscal year were down several $1 billion already. The governor came out against the ballot measure that would have raised income taxes more, because I think he's afraid that if we start adding more to the marginal income tax rate of California, and that would have pushed it up to over 15%, we will see a greater exodus of people out of California, like Elon Musk, the most famous expatriate, out of California into Texas or Nevada or other small, low or no income tax regimes. This is a serious issue because it's really we're already bleeding high income taxpayers in California. There's leakage going on. It could become a complete rout under certain circumstances. So it could be a double whammy. It could be a recession that hits the incomes of high income taxpayers that are so essential. And we might see fewer of those taxpayers around in California. So
well, let me add one thing. It's maybe a triple whammy, which is that in this last COVID-driven recession, we didn't hit the wealth effect of regular people.
Right.
And in this one, we are. Because the interest rates have gone up, obviously home prices are coming down. This creates discontent across a much larger spectrum than just the 150,000 people that are propping up the state at the high end. This affects everybody that owns a home, and that nothing has given a homeowner greater glee than thinking that they're a millionaire now that they own a home, and nothing on the flip side of that strikes greater terror into their hearts than the notion that, oh my God, my wealth is falling apart.
Yeah, and I would even add another element to that, and that is the federal tax overhaul that basically eliminates the deduction of state and local taxes from federal income taxes, which means that the wealthy are feeling the fullest impact of those state taxes. They can't lay off on the federal government. All of these are huge factors. And again, one thing this year's legislative session proved, again, is that the dominant political culture in California's politics, the progressive wing culture, unions and their allies, wants California to become the first American social welfare state, become essentially like a Sweden or maybe Germany or Holland or something like that. And everything they did this year pushed California more in that direction. Now, that costs money. And the state had a revenue bump that came in after the COVID recession, $97 billion surplus, the governor said. Turns out it's not going to be nearly that big. And that was spent. It was spent on basically moving California towards this social welfare nirvana that they envisioned. Well, the bills will be coming due for that if there's a recession. And one thing that they have not done, if indeed they intend to have California move into that realm, those nations that the California progressives want to emulate raise taxes on everyone, not just the rich. You can't maintain a social welfare state on simply taxing the rich. You have to start taxing the middle class as well. And so there's probably going to be, whether it's during this a recession or elsewhere, there's going to be a come to Jesus moment at which, if California continues down this path that has been carved out by Newsom and the Democrats in the legislature, they're going to have to start taxing the middle class in some way to support it. Otherwise, it cannot happen.
Yeah. Lori, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I always think about it from a strategic standpoint in terms of pros and cons of what it would look like if Newsom was running for president, and when, I get asked a lot about, well, if Biden doesn't run in 2024 or whatever happens there, what about 2028? Who's the Democratic frontrunner? And Newsom's name always comes up for obvious reasons. And then preparing to have this conversation with you today, I made myself actually think about it a little deeper and say, okay, what are the pros and cons here? And, one of the biggest ones is if you've been governor of California, you've got a long track record. So that goes under the pro category, but it also goes under the con category. And you can see all the ways in which Newsom really appeals to the progressive base on a lot of these core issues, and he's got the right message. But some of the other things going on in California, they just kind of create their own, Republican attack ad in terms of the policies. The other thing too is that we always tend to like outsiders running for president. A few notable exceptions, like Biden, obviously, kind of the consummate insider. And state governors always end up on that list because we see them as not tainted by insider Washington politics. The problem with Newsom right now, though, would be that he's governor of the largest state. So it's not like you can be a governor, Bill Clinton, coming out of Arkansas, and people say, well, it's one of, smaller state, it ranks so low in all of these areas. I mean, California is the big leagues in terms of being governor and executive power. So the experience he would bring with him, he's going to bring all of that baggage and how he's dealt with policies here. And you also have to look at for the things that have improved in California. Yeah, there are a whole bunch of things that maybe aren't going to be better by then. The economy is going to have a big say in whether or not we actually move forward with dealing with homelessness in this state, natural resources in this state in terms of water and wildfires. And these are big issues. And I can just already hear all of the attacks against him. So, I can see a scenario where he could win the Democratic nomination. There's even a scenario where I think whether 2024, 2028, he could win the presidency, because we never really quite know what happens until we get into the election. But not going to be an easy road. And there's going to be a lot of strategic messaging going on to try to get around some of these issues that he's dealing with in California.
I think
I agree. These issues aren't going to get any easier in California in 2 years.
Yeah.
Homelessness, water shortages, electric blackouts, all that. I mean, it's a dream for an Oppo campaign. Yeah. Just start all the video clips of all the homeless encampments in Los Angeles and whatnot, and throw them up there and says, Gavin Newsom wants the rest of the country to look like California.
Exactly.
It's a dream situation.
Especially if it's coming out of the mouth of the governor of Florida or the governor of Virginia as the opponent. Right.
But I also think a very important thing, which is one of the key parts of what we do with the Feudal Future, is inequality. Is California the model of what kind of society we want to have? I mean, we've made a decision, I think, in California to basically gut a large part of the private sector middle class and make things very hard on the working class. That I could see that being an issue that really is going to be tough for Newsom, particularly because he comes across as gentry to start with. Mm-hmm. So you have a guy who just seems like almost a caricature of a rich guy running for office, but in a state which has about the highest level of poverty, the highest level of inequality of almost any state. Do you think that's going to be a problem for him? Obviously the mainstream media is never going to cover it because, you might as well take the Newsom for president flyers and put them into the newspaper, for about the quality of the reporting you get most of the time. But is this issue, because we think this is the biggest issue for California, is this enormous inequality.
He would say, I think he would say that, look, I've done my level best to level it up, and point to all the things he's done that's helped the poor, supposedly, income support, checks in the mail, health care, all this kind of stuff. He would say, and that would be his argument, that we need to basically go to a more like Western European society and do the income transfers, the redistribution transfers that would be required to end that poverty, or at least lower that gap between the rich and the poor. I think, what other argument would he have other than that? He would say, that's my strength. I've done this. I've tried to do this, or I've made steps towards leveling out that plan.
Yeah, but the argument that would come back at him would be, great. Okay, you've moved the floor up. It's the middle that's been hurt.
Yeah. And I would just say, I think there's a perspective out there of Newsom that maybe he doesn't think as deeply about these kinds of issues as he might need to as governor of California. I don't know. That's just, the view that I have heard others talk about. And maybe he could surprise us if he's running on the national level. He doesn't have any competition from the Democratic Party in California, so he doesn't really have to address these issues out on the campaign trail. Heck, he spent really all the months of leading up to the gubernatorial election this year, campaigning on a national level against Ron DeSantis, or, not really talking about the issues important to California. So not only can I see him easily attacked from the right on a lot of these issues in a national campaign, but, also on the left from within the Democratic Party. You've got the messaging from someone like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, or maybe AOC, as if, some people think she's got national aspirations. We'll see. But I don't know that he has a good answer from the left or the right on some of these issues. And so that really is one of the biggest disadvantages I think he would face if he wants to move beyond just being governor of California.
Well, and I think this is part of a structural problem, I think that he would face, which is, candidates who do well very often are candidates who come out of competitive political cultures. Mm-hmm. Bill Clinton had to appeal to conservative Democrats and independents to win in Arkansas. You can't run as a pure progressive in Arkansas. Successful, presidents, I think, may very well be, Nixon came from a competitive culture. Reagan, people forget, Reagan came from in those days, we had a two-party system, as I recall. Reagan had to deal with Willie Brown, whereas Newsom has almost no experience having to negotiate with political opposition. Isn't that going to be a problem when you run for president?
Yes.
My feeling is that if he has a presidential strategy, it runs something like this: run to the left to get the nomination, get to close out Elizabeth Warren, close out Bernie Sanders. Who else is there? Who else? Who's else? What other Democrats is there?
And they're serious alpacacas too.
Yeah. And so win the nomination and then run against a Republican candidate. It could be Donald Trump.
Well, that makes it easier.
Yeah.
Or even if it's Ron DeSantis or Greg Abbott or somebody like that, just run against them as brutalists, as bullies, as Trump clones, and just hit that thing just as hard as you possibly can on issues like abortion and the environment and gun control and that sort of thing. And thereby, don't run on your own record. Don't run on California. Run against the Republicans. And that's what he's been doing. He's doing that right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's
the Republican. Demonize the Republicans and you win the White House.
That's a scenario where I see him winning in a general election. If he's running against that kind of a candidate, then it becomes less about him and more about how bad the other guy is. But I think that his lack of experience having to work across the aisle, because there are so few Republicans up in Sacramento, would really start to show, not only in terms of policy conversations he would need to have in middle America as a presidential candidate, but let's face it, and I talk about this constantly with my students, how there's such a disconnect between how we select our presidents and then the expectation of what they need to do when they become president and must govern. And I think Newsom would be a classic case of someone who might be able to figure out how to win the presidency, but would have no clue what to do once he got to Washington. Because one, he's not a Washington insider, so he doesn't have that experience. And two, he doesn't know how to negotiate deals with not only a legislature who isn't, all in for him, but also everybody on the other side of the aisle. So I think that he would definitely have a difficult time, whether in 2025 or 2029, of actually figuring out how to govern. And that's one of the biggest disadvantages of the way that we elect presidents in this country.
Yeah, I agree. I think that he could easily be a disastrous president, but I think there is a pathway for him to become president.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and the interesting thing here is he has a 2-year, he has a 2-year runway to learn. Right. So the interesting question is, will he?
Yeah.
Right. You've got, we've been talking to some grassroots business organizations, and they're actually feeling like, in this 2-year period, there may be some room to be able to actually open up the agenda a little bit for a little bit more pro-business policies. I don't know. What's your sense on that?
My sense is that if he really is trying to run for president in 2024, or thinks he is, he will be doing more of what he is now, being the anti-Republican, progressive Democrat, being very, very aggressive in his attitude towards the Republicans, to set up a presidential campaign of demonizing the Republican candidate, no matter who it is. I think that's his natural bent. He's doing it right now. He's doing it right now. Why would you expect to do anything different? It doesn't matter then what you do in California. It only matters to how much you can galvanize activist voters to make you the Democratic nominee. Now, that may lead to a disastrous presidency, but I think Gavin Newsom would say, I'll worry about that later if I ever have the chance to do it. So
that's what all politicians say.
I think he will continue to try to make himself the spear point of the Democratic Party vis-a-vis the Republicans, probably for the next 2 years, whether he winds up running for president in 2024 or not. Even if he just winds up going for the Senate, or decides to just wage a campaign for 2028, I think that he's chosen that to be his thing. He's going to be the gladiator, the person with the spear that's out there in front to lead the battle. And I think he's comfortable in that role. He enjoys being in that role, and he thinks that's the way to make his political career extend.
Well,
Joel, final question to you.
Yeah, this has been really great. But I'm going to put you on the spot here. Okay, what if you were to predict by whether 2024, 2028, is Gavin Newsom ever going to become president from a scale of 1 to 10? 10 meaning that he's definitely going to become president, to 1 meaning he'll never become president. What number would you give for the chances of him being in the White House?
Go ahead.
I would give it a 5, only because I'm, if nothing else, pragmatic about this. But I can see a scenario where it can happen. But I can also see on the other side equally how it won't happen. Look, nobody can predict these kind of political circumstances. The political environment is so fluid. But I think that I think he's got a better shot, actually, if he would run in 2028, serving out his second term as governor, having that 2-year period before the general election with no full-time job other than campaigning. If he's got some, decent things to run on from accomplishments in California. In 2024, look, if Biden isn't on the ticket, if he announces he's not running or under some other circumstance, that's just going to be just a free-for-all within the Democratic Party. I could see him having an advantage there because he's governor of California and would have some good opportunities to raise a lot of money. But I'm not sure that he rises to the top when it goes, when it's an open race with an incumbent president in the White House. So
a lot of it depends on his calculation. If Biden's not running, he almost has to run if he wants to be president then, because somebody else will be elected in 2024, and that person will be the incumbent in 2028, and that becomes a more difficult task for anybody. It's all dictated by whether Biden runs again or not. If Biden's running, that's a different story. Then you have to assume that he's going to win, and the office will be open in 2028, at which time that scenario kicks in. At which time I think then he said, okay, I'm going to become a United States Senator. I think that's his better that's his better platform for running for president than being a private citizen. Because he's not done the sorts of things that you would necessarily do to become a private citizen candidate. Not unlike, say, Ronald Reagan, who ran as a private citizen, but only after spending years out there on the circuit, going to dinners and meeting and traveling and meeting with everybody. I don't think Gavin Newsom's capable of doing that. He's the guy who wants to do it from the top, through the media. He's not going to be wanting to lay any groundwork in terms of sort of grassroots campaigning that ordinarily would do. And I think it's all going to depend on whether Biden runs. But I would give it a number, I say 5.5. Maybe
Boy,
6.
this is let's not equivocate here.
I think it's better. It's better this way. It's better than 50-50 chance he's going to be president of the United States someday.
Terrific.
Well,
we will see. We will see what happens, and of course, it'll have a big impact on our feudal future. So, I want to say thank you to both Lori and Dan for being our guests today. This has really been a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And we look forward to seeing you on another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. Goodbye.
Thanks.